Kanvar caressed the polished wooden stock of his new crossbow. With it he held his new life in his hands. With the crossbow, he could be more than an indentured servant as he had been the last 5 years. Come sunset, he'd be free from Chandran, the Moran soldier Kanvar had indentured himself to for passage to Kundiland. Come sunset, Kanvar would be the dragon hunter he was meant to be. He smoothed the dragon scale armor he'd fashioned for himself from old bits of armor cast off by the Moran soldiers. It looked ridiculous, he knew. And his friend Rahi mocked him for it. But ridiculous or not, it might keep Kanvar alive in the jungle. The armor was light, but strong. It would protect him from lesser dragon's claws, fire, and poison. He wouldn't want to face a great dragon with a light crossbow, mismatched armor, and no sword. With any luck he wouldn't have to. He was a year older now than Devaj had been when he took fever. Kanvar had spent the last year in constant fear of taking sick with the dragon fever while still indentured to Chandran. The Moran army was still at war with the great blue dragons, fighting battles almost daily with the deadly monsters. If Chandran found out Kanvar was a Naga, Kanvar would receive a far more prolonged and painful death from the Moranese than what his mother had intended for him. Rahi raced past the soldiers that guarded the fortified colony and out to where Kanvar waited in the open area that had been cleared of jungle trees and tilled for planting. The tobacco and cotton plantations, along with timber export, plus gold, silver, and jewel mines, made the Moran colony the most successful in Kundiland and worth stationing an army at, to defend against the great blue dragons. Rahi kicked up a swarm of jeweled dragonflies as he ran. Their wings buzzed and their translucent bodies caught the sunlight, sending a disarray of colored dots across the ground around Rahi's feet. Kanvar waved the crossbow with his good right arm and smiled in triumph. He'd spent years taking extra chores and working well into the night to earn the money to pay for the weapon. You got it. Rahi skidded to a stop in front of Kanvar. Sweat soaked his face. Rahi had been taken as a slave by General Samdrasan when the Moran army conquered his mountain village on the coast of the Darbit continent. Though Rahi had lived for 2 years at the colony, he still hadn't adjusted to the heat, humidity, and thicker air on the coast of Kundiland. His short stout body was better suited for climbing high mountains than emptying the general's chamber pots and polishing his armor. Yes, I got it. Come on, I fashioned a target just past the field. Kanvar limped toward the edge of the field where he'd carved a target into an old torn-up tree stump. Rahi followed and watched while Kanvar readied the crossbow to shoot. Kanvar took a deep breath. It had been 5 years since he'd shot a crossbow, and the one he'd owned previously had been made especially to work with his infirmities. He was sure the one he'd bought now would work for him. It might just take some time to figure out how to use it. Shifting his weight to his crippled left foot, he set the tip of the crossbow on the ground. It had a steel stirrup at the top for the crossbowman to put his foot into. That would hold the crossbow in place while the string was drawn back. For a normal man, putting the right foot into the stirrup posed no problem. It took Kanvar a few tries, and he nearly tipped over in the process. If only his crippled left leg would hold his weight better. No matter. He didn't care how long it took him to master the new crossbow, or how much Rahi laughed at him. He would do it. Finally he got his foot in the stirrup and bent over to pull the string back to cock the bow. So easy, and yet somehow Kanvar lost his footing on the stirrup and the bow flipped up and slammed into a tender part of his anatomy. He doubled over in pain. Rahi patted his back. Are you all right, Kanvar? Maybe this isn't such a good idea. Life isn't so bad working for Chandran. He is patient and even-tempered unlike some. Rahi didn't need to name General Samdrasan as one of the soldiers who was anything but patient. Kanvar had seen enough bruises on Rahi to know exactly what his friend meant. Kanvar swallowed his pain, straightened, and worked his foot back into the stirrup. Rahi, when I become a famous and wealthy dragon hunter, I'll buy your freedom from the general. I can do this. I know I can. Sweat trickled in Kanvar's eyes as he bent over and fumbled with his good hand to redraw the string. He was used to working one-handed. It was his balance that plagued him now, his stupid weak left leg. The swarm of jeweled dragonflies buzzed around him. A hot wind rustled the leaves and vines in the jungle ahead and licked the target Kanvar had carved into the old tree stump. Rahi shuffled his feet. The scent of rain and decomposing leaves hung on the air and lingered on Kanvar's tongue. The air was so heavy and wet at the colony. It had taken Kanvar months to adjust to it when he'd first left the deserts of Varna behind and come over with Chandran. Now the dense air sat heavily on him, adding to the pressure of the string as he pulled the string back. He straightened slower this time, making sure of his balance. The bow creaked as the string pulled back into place and caught. Rahi sucked in a nervous breath. Kanvar reached for one of the 5 bolts that were secured to the leather crossbow harness he had strapped on his back. Each bolt was held tightly in place by a leather loop, and it took Kanvar a moment to wiggle one loose. Most men would raise the crossbow to a horizontal position with one hand while putting the bolt into the track. Kanvar couldn't do that. To compensate, he'd had to purchase the more expensive slurbow, which had a wooden leaf on top of the stock to hold the bolt in place while the crossbow was still vertical with Kanvar's foot in the stirrup and the stock of the bow leaning against his leg. Kanvar fitted the bolt into place and lifted the crossbow with his shaking right hand. It felt heavier after all the exertion to get it cocked and ready. He tried to sight the bow on the target, but his hand was shaking too badly. He'd miss by a long way if he loosed the bolt like that. He lowered the crossbow to the ground and shook out his right hand. Rahi bit his lip and looked at Kanvar with his round eyes that somehow always looked like a startled kitrat. "I just need a moment to relax," Kanvar said. Rahi let out a weak laugh. "Even a lesser dragon would have eaten you 5 times over by now. And you plan to head out into the jungle tomorrow morning?" Kanvar licked his lips and stared off into the dim green interior of the jungle beyond the field. Hunting dragons isn't just about shooting them. It's about knowing how to find and track them. It's about knowing their habits, where they eat, where they sleep, how they hunt. It's knowing how to survive in the jungle, how to avoid the dragons you don't want to face, and find the ones you're looking for. With any luck, I'll have the crossbow ready long before I have to shoot anything. Besides, that's why I'm practicing now." Kanvar let out a slow breath. Then in one steady motion he lifted the crossbow, sighted, and loosed the bolt. The bow jumped in his hand, but the bolt struck the edge of the target. Rahi let out a shout of triumph and ran to retrieve the bolt. "A fine shot," Chandran said from behind Kanvar. Kanvar jumped in surprise and whirled around, the crossbow clutched in his hand. He'd been focusing too much on the target to notice Chandran walk up behind him. Chandran folded his arms across the armor on his chest. The hot breeze ruffled his graying hair and short beard. He looked Kanvar up and down with a slight frown on his suntanned face. "I would have bet a week's wages you couldn't make that shot." Kanvar smiled. "I hate missing. It's too much work to find the bolt, and I can't afford to buy more just yet." Chandran laughed while Kanvar looked over his shoulder at Rahi pulling the bolt from the old stump. Kanvar had nearly missed, even at this close of range. 5 years ago, he'd have hit it dead center. But that was with a better crossbow and constant practice. "I can do better," Kanvar said. Rahi rushed back over, handed the bolt to Kanvar, and bowed to Chandran. "The general is looking for you," Chandran said. He frowned with concern as Rahi bolted back toward the colony. "That boy deserves better," Chandran muttered under his breath. Kanvar kept his plans to buy Rahi's freedom to himself and wondered why Chandran had come out of the colony. Certainly not to fetch Rahi for the general. "Did you need me?" Kanvar asked. Chandran had given him an hour of free time, and Kanvar still had most of that hour left. "I'm afraid so." Chandran turned his attention back to Kanvar. "Sorry to interrupt your fun. You do look ridiculous, you know that, right?" Kanvar ran his hand across his mismatched armor, faded great blue dragon hide, cast off from Chandran's old armor, a jagged square of tan Kanvar scales, bits of skin from lesser green dragons, a patch of black from a black monkey's heavy hide. Even his dragonhide boots were patched together, since no normal boot would fit his twisted left foot. He just needed bracers and a helm to complete the strange assortment of armor. "Yes sir, I do. But it's better than nothing." "Kanvar, you're too young to hunt dragons." Chandran had his eyes locked on Kanvar's bad arm and leg. He said young, but Kanvar knew he really meant crippled. You won't last a day out there. Chandran gestured toward the steaming jungle. Kanvar bit his lip, and slid the crossbow bolt back into its loop. He did not want to argue with Chandran about this, and he couldn't tell the old soldier the truth, that it was only a matter of time before the fever took Kanvar, and if Kanvar didn't find a great dragon to bond with before then, he would die. Hunting dragons was Kanvar's only possible path to survival. You're not going to take my advice, are you? Chandran said in a stern voice. Kanvar shook his head without making eye contact. Well, it's not sunset yet, and I have work for you. You'll have to do it before you go off and get yourself killed. Come on. Chandran strode back to the colony. Kanvar slid the crossbow into its leather harness on his back and tightened the straps to hold it in place, then he limped after Chandran, struggling to catch up. They left the fields behind and walked through the big stone gates. Vigilant soldiers guarded the gates and manned the heavy ballista mounted on top of the wall, loaded and ready to send steel spears shooting at the great blue dragons that so often attacked the colony. The tips of the waiting spears were set skyward since the blues came from the high mountains that jutted up out of the jungle not far from the coast and the colony which hugged the shoreline. A watchtower stood at the center of the colony, with mounted spy glasses that could see out across the ocean in one direction, and deep into the mountains from the other. Above the landing on the tower, a great bell hung, ready to ring a warning should the colony be attacked. It was important that the people farming outside the gates could get inside the stone buildings before the great blues descended with their superheated fire breath. Kanvar had been to the top of the tower once and been allowed to look out across the water through the spyglass. Past the shoreline with its black sand beach, past the still blue harbor, across the ocean, where far and away he imagined he could almost see Varna's shores. The Murnis kept as keen a look out of those shores as of the mountains. Varna wanted to claim all of Kundi land for itself, but the Murnis had no intention of letting Varna's army conquer their valuable colony. Kanvar tried not to think about his old home on the coast of Varna as he limped along behind Chandran. The buildings of the Muran colony were darker and sturdier than the sun-baked bricks of Daro. Rock to build the colony had been quarried from the cliffs along the shore. The black rock had sprung from an ancient volcano and, birthed as such, was resistant to fire. The great blue's flames, which could have melted Daro's buildings, flashed uselessly against the volcanic rock of the colony. Sure, it could get hot inside during a dragon attack, but the buildings stayed standing unless the dragons got their claws into them. Chandran led Kanvar past the army barracks to the Kamdar stables where a piercing Kamdar shriek filled the air, followed by the sound of wood splintering and a horrible scraping of claws against stone. The Kamdar keeper, his two assistants, and Samdrasen's second-in-command, Pachai, raced out of the stone building and slammed the door. From inside came more clawing and the scream of a very angry Kamdar. Still can't calm him? Chandran said as he walked up to the shaken group. Pachai's face contorted into a grimace. I don't understand it. He's been my best mount. I trained him up from a hatchling myself. It's like he's suddenly gone mad. Chandran put a hand on Kamvar's shoulder and propelled him forward to stand in front of Sadiq, the Kamdar keeper. Kanvar has a way with the critters. Why don't you let him take a look? Pachai sneered at Kanvar in disbelief. That Kamdar would kill him in half a heartbeat. Sadiq protested. Kanvar had made friends with Chandran's Kamdar, Trilok, within moments of meeting it. Kanvar preferred to sleep in the stall with Trilok, but seldom did. He couldn't risk anyone thinking he had some special affinity with dragons, even lesser ones. He'd befriended Pachai's Kamdar along with many of the others when he'd first come to the colony. Chandran laughed. I'm telling you, the boy's a natural with them. Let him try to calm it. Kanvar swallowed hard and shook his head. He couldn't do this with so many people watching, they might figure out what he was. Chandran's grip tightened on his shoulder like dragon talons digging into his flesh. You will do it? Chandran said in an angry voice. He'd never talked to Kanvar like that before. Still, Kanvar shook his head. You listen to me, boy. You're mine for the rest of the day, and you will calm Pachai's Kamdar. Because if you don't, we'll have to shoot it. That beast is worth a lot of money. Money I'll hold to your account if you fail. Understand? Kanvar gasped. That amount of money would put him in servitude for 3 more years. Ignoring the protests of the other men, Chandran opened the stone door a crack and thrust Kanvar inside. The door slammed shut behind Kanvar, leaving him in semi-darkness. Gray daylight shone in from the upper window slits. The windows were small to keep the great blues from reaching in and having a meal of the camders. The stable was a long low building that housed over 100 camders in sections of 10. The sections were separated by stone walls, but the stalls themselves were wooden since camders did not breathe fire. Kanvar peered into the darkness while waiting for his eyes to adjust. He relied instead on a different sense, one he never talked about. Somehow deep inside he felt the presence of the angry camder as well as the fact that the other stalls were empty. Ever so faintly he sensed the camders in the next section over. A loud shriek rent the air, and the camder burst out of a stall on Kanvar's left, tearing through the wood with its short front claws and slamming its long tail against the stone wall. The front claws were chipped from the creature tearing at the stone walls, and blood oozed around the nails. Condensation glistened on the camder's mottled tan and green scales. The creature heaved in short angry breaths. Scales along a section of its tail were mangled as if it had slapped the stone walls repeatedly, and a big round lump swelled on its left side above its ribs. The camder caught sight of Kanvar and dove at him, its short claws raking the air. Kanvar dodged out of its way, and the creature hit the stone door. Screaming piteously, the camder rubbed its left side back and forth against the door before twisting its head around and snapping deadly teeth at Kanvar. Kanvar ducked and scuttled away. The keeper was right. Pochai's camder had gone crazy. Waves of pain and fury lashed at Kanvar's mind. But he could not tell what had brought the animal to this state without touching a part of his own mind that he'd only touched once and avoided all the years since then, though the sound of his father's voice in his mind still haunted him. Kanvar, run! Kanvar wasn't ready to face that part of himself, but if he did not, the crazed camder would kill him. Kanvar limped along the row of broken stalls, trying to get more space between himself and the camder. The camder bellowed and charged after him. Kanvar ducked behind a splintered wall. No choice, Kanvar had to do it. It shouldn't be hard without his mother holding the singing stone with its painful voices. Kanvar touched the spot in his mind where he'd heard his father's last message. Once when Kanvar was young, his parents had taken him to see grandfather Ross's triumphant return from raiding a great red dragon's lair. He'd killed the dragon and paraded through the streets of Daro, holding the flashing red dragonstone high above his head while thousands of adoring people thronged him, shouting their admiration. So many voices raised in a jumble that Kanvar could not make out the words. So many people crowded around that little Kanvar had been pressed up against his father and smothered. He might have died if his father hadn't lifted him up onto his strong shoulders. The same sensation of indecipherable voices and a pressing throng leapt into Kanvar's mind now. Not the press of human bodies and voices, but those of dragons, all the camders in the stable, the kitrats that ran along through the sewage ditches, the jeweled dragonflies in the fields, the serpents that slithered along the jungle floor, the black monkeys that swung from tree to tree, and lesser green dragons, hungry, cunning and hunting. And beyond them a press of minds ancient and thoughtful. A flash of something that reminded Kanvar of the feeling of sitting at home by the fireplace on his father's lap. And then, shattering all the rest of the thoughts, those of the crazed camder that reared up in front of Kanvar, screaming and clawing. Kanvar felt the searing pain in the camder's side and the poison that maddened it. "It's all right," Kanvar whispered, holding a soothing hand out to the camder. From the creature's tortured mind, Kanvar knew it didn't understand his words, but his intent to help it trickled through. That's what it wanted, help. Why wouldn't the humans help it? "I'm going to help you," Kanvar said. "Just stay calm. Stay right there." The camder sank down on its haunches, whimpering. Kanvar eased around it and went to the tack room where the grooming equipment and saddles were kept. His side hurt like someone had shot a crossbow dart into him. No, not his side, the camder's. Poor creature. Kanvar opened Chandran's tack box and pulled out a pair of long-nosed tweezers. He limped back over to the trembling Kanvar and rubbed his hand down the creature's smooth scales. I'm going to help you, but you have to hold still. Hold still and let me help. The Kanvar let out a piteous wail but remained sitting. Kanvar stuck the nose of the tweezers up under the scales near the lump on the creature's left side. He squeezed the tweezers closed and gave a sharp tug. The Kanvar shrieked and bolted away, leaving Kanvar holding an engorged razor beetle that had somehow worked its way up under the Kanvar's scales and latched on, pinching, sucking, and spreading its poison through the Kanvar. The Kanvar moaned, staggered into the remains of a stall, and lay down on a pile of straw. Kanvar pulled his mind away from it. The sudden silence in his head was deafening, and a feeling of lonely emptiness swept over him. Kanvar shuddered and fell to his knees, shaking, still holding the ghastly beetle in the tip of the tweezers. That's how Chandran, Pachai, and the keeper found him when they rushed in after hearing the sudden silence in the stable. A razor beetle, Sadiq exclaimed. No wonder. My poor Kanvar, Pachai said. He'll need medicine to counteract the poison. Sadiq rushed to the tack room and came back with a thick paste to put over the wound. The Kanvar lay still and let him apply it now that the razor-sharp pain in his side was gone. I guess you were right, Chandran, Sadiq said. The boy is a natural. I'll take him as my apprentice as we agreed. Good work, lad. Kanvar dragged himself to his feet. I don't understand. Chandran gave him a wide smile. I know you like working with the Kanvars. I just apprenticed you to Sadiq. It's an honorable position, much better than someone like you could ever hope to attain. But at sunset, my indenture is over. I'm going to, no. You are not going out into that jungle. I could never live with myself if I let you do that. The papers are already signed. You are now Sadiq's apprentice. It's all fixed and legal. Come on, let's go get your things. Pachai took the tweezers with the beetle from Kanvar's hand and squashed the beetle with a loud splat between the sole of his boot and the stable wall.